Hi everyone, today I want to talk about a list of things that I would like to see changed in Diablo 4. So I took some time to put together this little document here. It's like a one-page list of things. I have 6 different topics with a few sub-categories. Generally, I'm very happy with Diablo 4 and how it has turned out, and I'm very excited to see more content, more items, more builds, all the good stuff that we're gonna see in seasons. So I'm not really too worried about Blizzard basically making a move and producing more variety in the game, but there are some general topics that I want to address here that I think are more long-term oriented, more like permanent changes to how certain things work in the game. So I'm not going to talk about class balance or builds, because those are a continuous process that evolves over time anyway, and it's more about the general things here. So let's start with the first topic, UI. I think this is probably the weakest point of the game right now. The UI, especially for PC players, is really bad. So PC players are used to quality of life features. They're used to having, a well-designed UI in these kind of games. And it's pretty obvious that Blizzard did not really go through and make like a proper PC UI. The game is designed for both PC and console at the same time, but I think it's inevitable that we see some improvements here, at least for the PC side of things. For console, at least, or for controller, I have heard relatively good things about the game, so I'm not really too worried there. And obviously stuff like a search function, cannot exist really on a controller, so this is obvious. But I think for PC players, having like a stash that is searchable, where I can type a name of an item, or I can type a stat of an item, or I can type a keyword of a legendary aspect, these are the absolute basics that need to exist. Because the stash is, even with good management, a pretty big mess when you just start throwing out items there. So it's very hard to actually find the stuff that you want to find. Then we have the mark as junk feature. So a lot of people don't really know this, but you can hover over an item in your inventory and you can press space. I don't know what button it is on controller, but it will be marked as junk, and then you can go to the blacksmith and salvage all junk, or you can go to a vendor and right click one item that is marked and everything will be sold that is marked. So I use this feature quite a lot, but the only reason I use it is because there's a lack of way better features in this game. Basically, this Marcus Junk feature is the exact opposite of what an ARPG needs. Like, every item that drops is expected to be trash until 0.01% of the time you actually find something that you want to wear. So what we actually need is not a Marcus Junk, but we need something as marked as not worthless trash. Especially once you go to the higher levels, let's say like past campaign or so level 50 onwards, so literally like 99% of the game, you're not gonna find items that you're gonna equip very frequently. So, every few hours, maybe you're gonna replace one of your item slots, and it just becomes like more and more rare that you actually find an item that is an upgrade. So in general, the base expectation is that everything you pick up will be sold to the vendor. Which brings us to the next point. We don't even have a sell all button. So the main way to deal with bad items is that you sell them to the vendor, you don't actually salvage them. So at least like past level 50 or so on your first character, we should just salvage everything until then. So here and there you do some events that give you some materials, you click on like an ore vein that gives you some materials, you find materials from monsters. In fact, like you might have seen this raw hide video of mine where I capped out on raw hide, and now every time I run a dungeon there's like 1,000 little raw hide pieces scattered everywhere. So you don't need salvage materials, that's the bottom line. You want to sell items to the vendor for gold, so that you can use that gold for way better purposes. And the game makes it really hard to do that. You have to mark every single item as junk one by one, even though I already know that 99.9% of it is junk. And as I said, this is the complete opposite of what we need in this game, basically. Funny little extra, if you mark items as junk and you also mark sigils as junk and then you vendor an item, it will also vendor your sigils from your consumables inventory. That's great, for 1 gold by the way. So obviously that is not supposed to happen, so please fix. Speaking of sigils, we definitely need an extra inventory for that, and we probably want a bigger inventory as well. I think having like a variety of sigils to run is quite important, and you want to try to stack up maybe multiple of the same dungeon. You want to try to maybe stack up some for pushing later. You want to try to stack up some that you use for glyph, ranking up. So in general, it's good to have like more options. And whenever you pick up potions, they get like thrown in there, and you have like a half inventory full of potions and another half of sigils, and it's all like a mess. So in general, then you just need to have like a separate inventory. So at least the sigils. I think all the consumables like elixirs and the keys and I don't know what else, the scrolls, I guess, they can have like their own inventory, and then the sigils their other inventory. And I also would like to see a dedicated storage for legendary aspects. We already have that in the inventory. You have like a tiny like legendary aspect bag basically, but this is not anywhere near enough. In my stash right now, playing a single class rogue, I have 2 out of 4 stash tabs completely dedicated to items that I may want to extract. So one problem with extraction is that if you extract the item, you cannot later sell the aspect for the same value back to the vendor in case you don't need it. So you're kind of forced to just keep a bunch of items around in your stash that you may want to extract, but you may also find a better version until later when you need them. So you always have to keep up like a few backups. You always have like a lot of clutter in the inventory. And number one, I would like to see the gold cost of the extraction being equal to the vendor price, so that I can just get rid of these aspects again if I want to and not feel bad about it. And number two, I think we need something like an actual real storage where you have filters, a little bit like the Codex of Power, but for like basically items or like the extracted aspects. So that, for example, you can have like, let's say 5 copies of every single aspect extracted there, and you have like, you know, like some nice, you know, categorized like stash, so to say, dedicated to these legendary aspects. This could be even directly at the occultist where you do all the imprinting. So this can be kind of like tied into this whole Codex of Power system, I think. People want to try to save up aspects for later. They want to experiment with other builds, and it will like massively free up storage space, which is very, very limited. Which also brings me to the next point. Yeah, gem tab and more storage space. So the stash space in general is very tiny for such a game, especially with the huge variety of stats that can roll on items and the stats that are needed for certain builds. So for every single build, you need to have like a specific glove. You may also want to switch out something like boots and pants or helms for like extra skill ranks, or you want to like change your damage stats on your rings. You want to change your amulet rolls for like another passive. You know, there are so many items you have to keep in order to have like a working build if you want to switch to something else. And on top of that, we have trading in this game. So you also want to keep some stuff on the side that you don't need, but someone else can need. Moving on to part 2, the dungeon farm. So I think a lot of people have seen this or done this. People just keep resetting the same dungeons over and over. And Blizzard has been nerfing the best dungeons over and over as well to try to disincentivize this strategy. And personally, I really agree with this. I think it's extremely boring to just farm the same dungeon like 100 times a day. And instead, there should be more variety in the content that you're doing. So number one would be a better incentive for nightmare dungeons. It's almost there, I would say. Personally, I've been doing almost entirely nightmare dungeons ever since launch, basically, with a bit of other stuff in between. But for the most part, it was that, and I am relatively competitive with that. But it's harder to do, and it's not exactly a lot more rewarding aside from the glyph experience and maybe some more unique drops. So I would like to see like maybe a bit better incentive for nightmare dungeons, especially on the XP side. So like the end of run rewards could be beefed up a little bit, for example. In general, I would like to see a more incentive to stay in the game versus relogging all the time. We have elixirs that disappear when you log out, but they are almost worthless anyway on normal difficulty with only a 1.66% XP boost. So no one really cares about that loss. And I would like to see just something that kind of like keeps you in the game and, you know, not have this like, you know, leave party, reset dungeon, or like log out, reset dungeon kind of strategy involved. In general, I think especially the open world could be a good point here, where maybe go around, maybe do some events, maybe do like a world boss, you know, whatever pops up basically. Just like have like this feeling of exploration a little bit. And this would lead to the game just feeling a lot more diverse in the content that you can do, if especially the open world is buffed a little bit and maybe gives you like a reason to stay in the game. This Nephilim Vader buff, if you don't know it from Diablo 3, this was a buff that when you defeated an elite pack, you got a stacking XP and magic find buff and up to 5 times. So this was kind of the reason to stay in a game instead of doing basically exactly what we did back in early vanilla T3, where people were also like relogging like every 30 seconds trying to farm like the most effective little dungeon. Then I would also like to see maybe a bit more quality of life for Nightmare Dungeon grinding in particular, especially something that skips the travel sometimes would be really cool to have. So for example, just an idea, a scroll of nightmares. We already have like the scroll of escape. So I think like these scrolls could be like a kind of cool like way to introduce teleports or maybe other effects to the game. For example, like, you know, maybe every 1 in 20 completions, you get like one of these scrolls, and at least here and there you can kind of like skip the long run to a dungeon and you just get like instantly teleported into a dungeon when you use it. So when you kind of feel like not traveling, that'll be nice to have. A lot of people are complaining about the long travel times and the downtime between dungeons, which kind of ties in with this like lack of open world content that you want to do, especially at level 100. Monsters camp out at level 95, and there's really nothing to gain in the open world that much anymore besides running to a Nightmare Dungeon. Like the events are kind of worthless at some point, the monsters don't give XP anymore. At least below level 100 you can kind of like grind your way towards a Nightmare Dungeon, but at level 100 there's really no reason to do anything on the way there. So skipping the run sometimes and also beefing up the open world in general would be definitely the way to go in my opinion. Then something that I think is not the most major problem right now, but will absolutely become a major problem very soon, is the lack of target farming. So we have the Codex of Power, which is kind of nice, but it also lacks a lot of the crucial pieces that make builds work. For example, especially in Druid, I think there's like almost none of the build-defining legendaries in there. And on top of this, they also need certain uniques that are even more build-defining than that. So in general, certain builds rely on certain powers or certain uniques, and we have no way to really get them if we want to. So I think we need to have some kind of system. What comes to mind here is the divination card system of PoE, for example, that you can kind of like target farm certain zones, certain dungeons, certain monsters, certain bosses, like all these kind of things to try to kind of like improve the odds for getting a certain item for you. Now, I'm not a big fan of the divination card system in general, but it does solve the problem of target farming. And I would like to see something for Diablo 4, especially when there is more aspects and more uniques being introduced every single season. Getting the one that you want for your build is going to be more and more difficult unless they up the drop rates, which they absolutely should not do. Like the drop rates are already pretty high in my opinion, but we need some kind of target farming for aspects. And then another point here is more variety in the content to 100. So in general, I think that a lot of people are really emphasizing the dungeon grind, and the game is also kind of like pushing you towards that because of this reset strategy, because Nightmare Dungeons exist where you can actually choose the difficulty and you can choose how much XP you gain for a run. So they are generally way better XP wise on the way to level 100 than outdoor content. And again, at level 100, you also don't really care about outdoor content in general anymore. So I think it just needs to be beefed up. Point number 3 is solo versus group balance. So I think it's pretty obvious that solo players are massively disadvantaged, and I think this should not, be such a massive gap at the very least. So I think the main problem here is there's unlimited range on shared XP, at least in dungeons. So you go into a dungeon, people right now are farming blind burrows, they go in, they spread out in 3 different directions, they clear the whole thing in 1 minute, TP out, reset, go again. And like this, they farm at least double the XP of like whatever the best solo player could achieve, I'd say, plus minus a little bit. So it is extremely effective and kind of like makes it just feel bad for playing solo. So this is something that has to be fixed. There should be a cap on this shared XP range. Something like 2 screens or so is probably fine. I think it's like similar to the party buff. This would also prevent, for example, these boosting strategies from being as effective as they are, where people just make a level 1 character and then they're like level 50 in like 20 minutes or something. At least you would have to try a little bit, go together as a team and have actual like a group gameplay and not just go into a dungeon together, but then everyone does their own thing. In general, this whole like resetting of dungeons, events, rare spawns is really overpowered in groups. So maybe this can be adjusted a little bit so that you can't just like, TP in and out and do some shenanigans of leaving party and coming back and all that to just like infinitely grind the best stuff ever and get like, thousands of obols per hour and all that stuff as well. Then we have sigil drops. So in Nightmare Dungeons in particular, people that did not open the Nightmare Dungeon also find sigils for themselves. Again, this is another example of something that PoE does right, in my opinion, compared to Diablo 4. Map drops only drop for the map owner and you don't get more map drops from having more people present. So the map drops are always the same, so that developers can actually streamline and balance out those drops, like in that case those sigil drops, so that you have like a continuous, regular income of sigils. But what you can actually do is, in a party, you go in there, you open one sigil, and then everyone finds sigil drops, and suddenly you multiply the number of sigils that you can run. And especially when it comes to like very high tiers where sigils are extremely expensive to craft and are also like very sought after for like the right combos of the dungeon plus affixes and all that, this multiplying strategy of groups is completely busted. And especially maybe in like future seasons when you have like Nightmare Dungeon leaderboards, this will be a major problem. So I think it would be best to simply address this as soon as possible, get rid of sigil drops for people that have not opened the sigil. Only the owner should get those sigil drops. And this also prevents, for example, groups from being very overpowered with just finding the same sigils over and over. I did this in a 2-man party for like an hour or so. I was farming with Scissoran, and we were able to chain the same dungeon like 5, 6, 7 times in a row sometimes, which is like absolutely unthinkable as a solo player. And we were only 2 people. With 4 people, you're gonna find so many duplicates of the same dungeon that you can basically never travel anywhere, and you have even higher group efficiency because you don't have to go anywhere and you don't have to like change dungeons. You can just farm the best dungeon over and over. So this is definitely an issue. And lastly, revives are also really overpowered in party. So first of all, you can actually channel a revive, come back and then finish channeling it, so it kind of like saves the progress, and you can just like do it whenever you want. So you don't have to like stand there for like 5 seconds in a row, which is already really overpowered. But they also can be done during a boss fight like Uber Lilith apparently. So that should absolutely not be a thing in my opinion. You should go in as a team and, well, you either win or you lose as a team in my opinion. And you shouldn't have like a dedicated like reser in your party that just goes around, presses flame shield and reses everyone. And like, it seems completely busted and also not like a fun or exciting gameplay. And on top of that, I think also party revives don't even count towards the revives in Nightmare Dungeons. So when you try to push, for example, you can just like revive each other as long as it's not a full team wipe. So this might also be a problem. Okay, point number 4, Renown. So personally, I'm a huge fan of the Renown system. I know that it's kind of a grind and a lot of people think that, oh, really do I have to do this again? But I think that the Renown system does a really good job at actually incentivizing you to do different content instead of just dungeon grind from 1 to 100. Like the Renown part is actually still a relatively small part of the entire journey, and it only has to be done in your first character, or maybe you're gonna reroll very early and then maybe on your second character a bit as well. But for the most part, the Renown grind is already a relatively small part of the grind. And maybe some people are not aware of how long it actually takes to get to 100, but trust me, it is very long. And personally, I've been really enjoying just going around the world, doing this dungeon there, doing some events here, doing a stronghold there, just finding all the stuff, unlocking the entire map. And I have a really good time doing that also on my alts. And the problem is, it is really worthless doing it on your alts. You get like this XP bonus when you finish a Renown chapter in one of the regions, but it's like half a bar of XP out of 10, so that is pre-level 50. So it's just like not worth it at all. And I think these XP rewards should be like really beefed up so that, you don't have to do it, but it will be like a viable strategy at least to just run open world content, finish a Renown in every region, get like a juicy chunk of XP, like a half level here, half level there for doing one of these Renown chapters, and just enjoying this variety of content instead of this endless Nightmare Dungeon grind or just normal dungeon grind even. And a similar train of thought applies to campaign. Campaign is kind of nice. I think the campaign is well designed. It's a cool story, and it kind of like has like this, progression through the zones and through like the levels, and you have these boss fights that are pretty cool. But I think that almost no one will actually play the campaign again in the future because it's simply not really effective. It just takes much longer to level up in the campaign than it does in skipping the campaign on your alt. So I think that it could also boost these XP rewards, maybe for like each of the major bosses you kill, get like a juicy chunk, like a level or something like that. So that kind of evens out. Like, I'm totally fine with both Renown and campaign not being the absolute fastest strategy, so we don't want to force people to do Renown or even on the alts, or we don't want to force anyone to do campaign on the alts. But right now it's not even in the same galaxy basically. Then we get to number 5, which is hardcore. So hardcore had a lot of problems back in the open beta. I made a video about that. There were like many major exploits. You could like just not die by logging out or out of foring, and yeah, in general, you could even revive your character with Task Manager if you did it at the right timing. So it seems like all this stuff has actually been fixed pretty last minute, it seems. So that's really great. But we have some other problems now. So a lot of people died to disconnects and lags and certain bugs. We saw a lot of rip clips on, you know, streamers and all that. I'm not gonna give all the examples now, but yeah, in general, you have to be quite lucky to dodge the bullet if you play all the way to the 100 on hardcore. So in general, I think there should be maybe like a rollback for characters, especially for server-side disconnects, for server maintenance disconnects, for all this kind of stuff. I think it would be fine to like make like a minor rollback basically of like a minute or two or something, so that we make sure that hardcore characters stay alive when something server-side happens. Also, the scroll of escape is not actually doing its job. So if you don't know, hardcore has a scroll of escape that allows you to instantly teleport to QoL. Then this just is a random drop. You can just find it and then you can use it whenever you want, as long as you're not crowd controlled, which is a good way to get to safety, to, you know, attempt the boss fight and get out in case you realize you can't do it and these kind of things. So I think that the scroll of escape is a very cool tool to have, and it kind of serves this purpose of having a backup plan for your hardcore character. I think in general hardcore is designed very fairly, very well in Diablo 4. So I've been playing exclusively hardcore so far, and I had a really great time. I think it's a really good game for hardcore. But these bugs and disconnects definitely need to be addressed. The scroll of escape not actually teleporting you to safety when you are in combat and DC is a problem. So this was the original developer intention, like, you know, years back they said they made a scroll and it will automatically trigger when you DC, but this is absolutely not the case. If you DC, you're dead. So it's really a problem. I think the scroll of escape could be more rare as a result of, you know, this being fixed, so that people also can't abuse the system too much. I think if scroll of escape would drop at maybe something like 10 or 20% of the current drop rate, that would be absolutely fine. I have literally like almost 200 of them in my stash right now, so they do drop a lot when you play a lot. And it would be fine if they're just more rare, and, you know, they don't give you like infinite attempts on boss fights, and they don't give you like infinite safety nets on DCs. And lastly, there's this elixir of death evasion. So if you don't know this is an elixir that you can craft only on hardcore. It requires a few materials that you can kind of target farm, which has two problems. Number one, it removes the most important thrill of playing hardcore, which is that you can die at any moment. When you have this elixir, you cannot die. This also means you can do infinite attempts on Uber-Lilith. This means you can do infinite attempts of hardcore, like, you know, high-tier Nightmare Dungeon pushing. Just in general, it's basically softcore again. So we have the same problem that we had in Diablo 3, where we had cheat deaths, and cheat deaths ruined hardcore in Diablo 3, because, well, it's not really hardcore anymore. The whole point of hardcore is the thrill, and that you cannot make mistakes, and that you can prove your worth as a good player of this game, compared to softcore, where nothing really matters. And the way this works right now in hardcore is that people just like target farm these materials, which is relatively easy to do. So you can have like permanent elixir of death evasion, and you're basically never at risk of dying. So I think the solution here is to either completely remove the elixir of death evasion, because, as I mentioned, hardcore is very fair in Diablo 4. This is not PoE where you just randomly get one shot by stuff. Almost always when you die in hardcore, it will be either to a bug, to a DC, or to your own failure. So we don't need this elixir at all, as long as the scroll of escape is working. And if the developers should really want to keep this in the game, I think at the very least it could become a drop and not a craftable item, because right now, basically what people do is they just like progress more slowly, or they just like take extra time to farm a bunch of these elixirs, and then they go back to just doing whatever they wanted anyway. So it's basically just softcore with extra steps when it comes to, for example, Uber-Lilith attempts. You never go in there without this elixir. You go in there with the elixir, you either beat the boss, or you could trigger the elixir and you TP out of scroll of escape. So I think that is just not how it should work on hardcore. I think it would be alright if these were drop only and not craftable, and, you know, maybe get like one of them like every 10 or 20 hours or so that occasionally you can like stock up on them and then maybe use them for something like an Uber-Lilith attempt, or something like you know, high Nightmare Dungeon push or something like that. But yeah, right now, this elixir in the game and also the flame shield enchant on the Sorg, I said this many times already, I think these things should not be in the game. They just ruin the game mode. And our last topics here are quality of life. So most importantly, loot filters. This ties a little bit into what I said at the start with this, sell all, market's junk, everything is trash. I think that, loot filters would be required. So especially once you go to the higher levels, like level 80, 90, etc. Like, you rarely replace your items because you already have really good loot. And you're only looking for like, small upgrades, or you're looking for like, the GG drop that you can maybe sell to someone else. So in general, you just have to sift through so many items at the vendor and sell them one by one. It's just so much work, and there's not really a point in doing that. So I don't think we need a loot filter that actually like not shows items on the ground necessarily. Maybe you could say, okay, I don't want to see sacred items anymore because, for example, after level 70 or so, I never pick up a sacred item again. So I don't want anything that's like below item power 700. I only want the highest rolls of the possible stats. There are many ways to build a loot filter, but I guess the one really obvious choice here would be that we can hide, blue items, white items. We can hide sacred items, after level 70 or so. I basically never pick up sacred items again. I only want ancestrals. So, or I want to at least have like a certain item power. Maybe you could actually like, just select like a certain item power. And then of course we need to be able to select certain stats. So, I want to have a chest piece that has damage reduction and total armor and life and, close damage reduction. And it should have like 3 out of those 4 stats, for example. So I want to like kind of like have a system where I can select, okay, highlight this item, item power 700 plus, with at least 3 out of those 4 stats, or something like that. And then I just go through and like, item by item, and just kind of like select the stuff that I want on these items. And the loot filter doesn't necessarily have to like remove all items on the ground, so you still want to pick them up for gold and sell them and stuff like that, for example. But at least you could like highlight them with like a special beam, a special color or something, that's like part of your selection on the filter, for example. And it could also be highlighted maybe in your inventory. And then, for example, when you press this supposed sell all button, your loot filtered items don't get sold, for example. So there could be like, a tie-in into like various systems here where it just massively improves the farming experience, especially in a high end. Most people might not have experienced this yet because they're not like high enough level, but as I said, like post level 80 or so, it is so rare to ever find an upgrade, and like 99% of the loot just goes straight to the vendor. I think on a similar note, I don't see a reason to actually label items on the ground with sacred and ancestral, because those 2 labels don't actually have like a real significance besides like that little glowy icon and some very minor things. But in general, what you care about is the item power of an item. So I think that in the parentheses, instead of sacred and ancestral, you could literally just say a 3-digit number. So 724 or 811 or something like that. And that would also like just be like a way better way of just sorting out the loot as you pick it up, because you know that you got something on your hands that might be really good. You can actually find ancestral items that are below the 700 item power threshold, so you can't even upgrade them to the ancestral tier of stats, for example. So you can kind of get baited into picking up an ancestral that is not actually an ancestral item. And last but not least, the SSF tag for characters, or some kind of SSF mode. If you don't know SSF, this is again a thing from Path of Exile. It's called solo self-found. So this means no grouping, no trading. Both of these things are extremely powerful in Diablo 4. And a lot of people like to have this challenge and just to get solo experience of playing on their own, doing their own thing. And especially when it comes to having leaderboards later in the game, I think this is going to be inevitable to make something like this, because group play is simply so much more effective. And I don't want to like disincentivize group play necessarily. I want to bring it, more in line with solo, as I mentioned here, with the balance. But in general, there should be like the option of, being more of a solo guy or more of a group guy, so that, everyone gets something out of the game. I don't expect that Blizzard would ever make like dedicated like solo servers. I guess this would go way beyond like their capacities in terms of like the costs and all that. But you could just have like a character that has like a solo self-found tag. I mean, you create a character, for example, and it just has like this kind of like, I don't know, maybe like a special color in the name, or some other like indicator on the character when you inspect them. I don't know what, but there's definitely a way to do that. And this will just be like an SSF character, so that people can show off, that people can have like maybe have separate achievements for that, complete tier 100 9 dungeon solo, So they could still run around in the same world that other people run around in, and they could still, you know, occasionally find people doing a random event or, you know, on the world boss. It doesn't really matter too much. It doesn't really impact the solo gameplay much. But, you know, all these group farming strategies revolve around grouping, and you would be excluded from that, which is the most important part. And of course, you should have the option to actually break up with the solo mode at any point with your character. So for example, if you decide at level 100, you know, you've done the entire journey and now you want to group up with other people and try some stuff, you should be able to do that and then kind of like lose this solo tag. I think a system kind of like that would be the way to introduce solo self-found into Diablo 4. It would be like a very like non-intrusive way, and I think it would really make a lot of people happy without really any downside to it. And that's it for this document. So these are my points for now. Obviously there is more stuff, but as I mentioned, I am generally happy with the game, and I will definitely make other videos similar to this at some point. So let's see how it continues from here, how the balance shifts, what other kind of topics come up. If you have anything else that I completely missed here, if there's something you're really unhappy with that I didn't mention, let me know and maybe I can bring it up next time as well. So that's it for now. I hope you liked this, and see you guys next time.